It's not only buildings which give the city its character. It's the things we pass by every day with barely a second glance. Like this old painted advertisement near Liverpool Street, a reminder of a time before billboards and hoardings when all you needed to get your message across was a patch of wall and a tin of paint. All over London, if you look closely enough, you can find little ghosts of our past, like this for instance. Royalty, Hayward & Co, tennis racket manufacturers. So easy to walk past and miss altogether. In today's journey through disappearing London, I'll be tracking down some other pieces of our vanishing history. I'll be remembering the far-off days when motoring in London was something people actually did for fun. And discovering the story of this amazing Victorian theatre. But first, the people who count these sort of things reckon that around 200,000 cars, buses and taxis travel through central London every day. And if you think that's a lot, how about this for a statistic? 100 years ago, 300,000 horses lived in London, plying their various trades on the streets of the city. Imagine the traffic jams they caused. 100 years ago, horses ruled the streets of London. As you can see, rush hour in 1910 was a pretty chaotic affair. Horses also created their own pollution problem. Thousands of tons of manure had to be cleared from the streets every year. A whole army of young chaps like this, street orderly boys as they were called, were employed just to sweep paths through the horse dung covered streets so that the gentlefolk could cross without getting their shoes dirty. Crossing sweepers were the bottom of the pile, but thousands of other Londoners also made their living from working with horses. It's a very different story today, of course, when horses are a much less common sight on the capital streets. But there are a few people keeping the old traditions alive. People like Jenny, who has one of the few Mews stables still operating in central London. I'll be visiting her place later in the programme. But first, I've come to Camden to find out more about the heyday of horse-drawn London. Today, the stables market is a maze of walkways and shops. But 100 years ago, the stalls here would have been full of a very different type of stock. The horses who lived here were used to transport goods brought into London by the railway lines, which funneled into this part of the city in the 19th century.
And that is the reason why this is here, because the goods would come in from the north. Remember, the north is the seat of the Industrial Revolution. There's all sorts of industries that are producing goods which have to come down to London.
Including coal, of course.
Coal,
yes.
Absolutely, principally, of course, from the coal fields up in Lancashire and Yorkshire. All of which has to come here, has to be sorted, has to be distributed. The only way you can do that, of course, in the Victorian era, before the days of motors, is horse and cart, horse and wagon, horse and van.
Plenty of goods trains still rumble through here today, but their cargoes make the onward journey by lorry rather than horse-drawn cart. And the old residents are long gone, even though there are still reminders of former times. There are horse-friendly ramps round every corner, and I wonder how many of them were tethered here over the years. And if the horses got sick, there was even a hospital on site to care for them. Today, part of it's a furniture shop, but tucked away among the tables and chairs are a few reminders of its former life. So, Roger, what do you think is still here that a Victorian would recognise?
Cast iron, immediately, straight away. The great structural material of the 19th century. You find it everywhere.
If you look at behind here, the slots for where the stalls would have been, the wood would have gone through here and to a wooden wall where the wall is now, and then carried on.
So this would have been a series of planks or something?
Yes.
Isn't that great? Yeah, that we've still got some real reminders of the reality of the fact this was once a stable. But there's more to these former stables than meets the eye. Beneath the cobbles, there's a network of catacombs which stretches all the way from Regent's Canal to Primrose Hill. 100 years ago, these passageways would have echoed with the sound of horses' hooves as they shunted railway wagons and carried goods away from the depot to other parts of the capital. The scale of this place really is amazing, but there would have been industrial-sized stables all over London, which shouldn't be surprising really when you consider the huge amount of jobs horses had to do. A ride with the omnibus horse cost £1 back in 1830. Horse-drawn cabs were even more expensive. They had to jostle for street space with the carrier horses, the equivalent of the modern-day white vans. But everything came to a halt when the Black Brigade passed by. Horses were everywhere. This whole city was heaving with them. In recent months, the owners of the stables have started to update the site to improve the experience for shoppers. In the process, some reminders of the old days have disappeared. And some fear that these former stables will be the next reminder of horse-drawn London to go. But of course, not all stables were built on the industrial scale on show in Camden. In the more exclusive residential areas of the city, horses were kept close at hand to power the family carriage. Most wealthy households had their own stables at the back of the house, complete with living quarters above for the staff. All over London, it's the same story. On the street side, the beautiful and grand facades of these fabulous houses. But tucked away just around the back was a whole other world the wealthy householders very rarely saw. In London today, there are over 600 mews. But in Victorian times, these places would have been smelly, dirty and overcrowded. Nowadays, it's quite a different picture. Most of them have been converted into very desirable residences. And the only thoroughbreds you'll see around here is of the four-wheeled variety. But whilst horses have disappeared from just about every other mews in London, it's a different story here, where Jenny is keeping alive an old tradition. She's one of the very few people to provide a full livery service, offering stabling to horses. And so what is your daily routine here?
It just depends really. Sometimes we do early morning riding. Starts about 7 o'clock, and then we would feed them, muck out. Being in London, it's quite different to any other yard because it's sort of a shop window for other things. We do sort of all sorts, any kind of work with horses really that makes money.
And how many horses do you look after?
6 currently.
And have you seen this business change in your lifetime?
Yes, very much so. We used to have loads of kids that would come and help and they'd get a free ride. And now insurance has gone sky high and the riding schools are going out of business left, right and centre, which is a crying shame because it means that only people who can really afford to keep a horse are going to miss out on the riding.
Back in the days when horses ruled the roads, a whole army of equine experts would have been on hand to cater for their every need, from dealers and feed merchants to vets and saddlers. But as the numbers declined, so did the number of people employed to look after them. Wayne is one of a dying breed, a farrier. His day job's with the household cavalry, but every few weeks he packs up his portable forge and makes the short journey to Jenny's stables. At a time when these muses would have been full of horses coming and going, there would have been a farrier presumably in this very street.
Yeah, a farrier would have been static because they would have needed a coke fire to actually heat the shoes up.
But you, of course, unlike those times, have got a portable farriers in the back of this van.
Yeah, definitely have, yeah. I've got my anvil, which I just pull out and sit it here.
Well, I'm glad to see that hasn't gone, the anvil.
No, the anvil doesn't change, it just gets smaller and lighter. I've got my gas portable fire, the gas bottle at the back. Just turn it on, light it, and heats up my shoes.
His forge may have adapted to the modern world, but the art of shoeing a horse hasn't really changed for centuries. And nor have Jenny's stables. Oh, I say to you, look at this little oasis of countryside and the hustle and bustle of the city.
I know, I'm very lucky.
How long has this place been here?
200 years.
Yeah. Has it changed much in that time?
Not really, no. It still has the same tiles and the same floor, and it would probably cater for more horses.
And it goes way back there. And how many horses can you get in here?
9. A push you can get 11, but what we tend to do now, if we have so many, some of them go for a break in the country. They just go up in the field for a month or two.
They're going on holidays tonight. What do you think the future holds for this place?
There's only 3 yards now left in central London. To ride around these streets is quite magic, I do have to say that honestly. And it would be a crying shame to lose it.
Beautiful creatures, aren't they? But I tell you what, I've been on a horse twice and I've fallen off twice. So this time I'm leaving it to the experts. Horses are an increasingly rare sight on London's streets these days, but the city wouldn't be the same without them. I'm pleased Jenny's doing her bit to keep the tradition of horse-drawn London alive for a little longer. Coming up later, we'll find out how the horse was finally driven from the streets of London by a four-wheeled competitor. And we get a glimpse inside a hidden London gem. Wow. An extraordinary place. For hundreds of years, horses ruled the streets of London. But then a new competitor revved into action and eventually put them out of business. The thing that finally sealed the horse's fate was the arrival of the petrol engine. The change from horse to petrol power didn't happen overnight, but some canny businessmen had covered themselves for all eventualities. Early views of motorists were pretty negative.
The Times famously referred to motorists as notorious carbarians. The Marquis of Queensberry actually sought a private Act of Parliament to get permission to shoot motorists on the grounds they endangered his family.
Not entirely wrong.
Not entirely wrong. And of course the police couldn't keep track either. The early flying squad had no vehicles and was instead issued with what they called egg bombs, which were small containers of green and white paint to hurl at motorists who were misbehaving.
Again, not entirely wrong.
Absolutely perfect.
I would love to see the flying squad today armed with flower bombs, or traffic wardens, certainly. So was it all progress?
Absolutely not. You know, if you think cars to begin with weren't really seen as a serious means of transport, they were just a little peculiarity. They appealed to rich aristocrats as a new plaything, and it was only over time that people gradually began to see they might have a practical application.
And when did that come about?
It took a long time. The transition took a long time. I think as late as the mid-1930s, when they were building the big arterial roads into London, a good 5%, that's 20,000 vehicles on those arterial roads were horse-drawn. Just imagine, you've got motor buses, motor lorries, motor cars, and men pulling wagons with horses. And they were slow. You know, hackney carriages, we still use the term now. It's got nothing to do with E8. It's a French word, a hackney, I think it's pronounced, which means ambling nag, because these horses, by now, were regarded as seriously slow.
By the 20s, the car was a much more common sight on London's streets. Most reminders of the golden age of London motoring have long since bitten the dust. But tucked away behind Tottenham Court Road is one survivor from the days when the Ford Talbot and the Morris Oxford owned the roads. This is the Bloomsbury Garage, built in the 1920s when cars were little more than a rich man's plaything. It's an extraordinary survivor from the days before the big petrol giants took over the business of selling Londoners their fuel. Hey there, Tim.
Hi, Suggs. How are you? Nice to meet you.
Very good, thank you. Well, what a beautiful spot you've got here, Tim. And firstly, I've got to say, I've even lived in this area and I've never noticed it before.
It's amazing, isn't it? Lots of people have said that. They've lived here for many, many years and just suddenly come across the place. It's incredible.
And a labour of love from the look of how you've decorated them.
Yeah, we keep it up, painted and looking good all the time. It's in our interest to do this anyway. It keeps the area looking good and smart and nice.
It looks like a Toy Town petrol station, and you'll be a bit jealous to learn the original customers would have paid just over £1 for their gallon of petrol. Things have changed a bit since then. In fact, there are all sorts of ways in which this place is slightly out of step with the modern world of motoring. When this little old place was built, there weren't many motor cars around, and there certainly wasn't the demand for petrol that there is today. And I'm glad I'm not backing it out. Now he's reclaimed his forecourt, Tim's dug out a plan of how the garage looked when it was first built. It hasn't really changed a great deal since then.
As you can see, the railings now are much lower. These were cut down during the war. These pillars were removed at a later date because the access to the building wasn't wide enough when the cars got bigger. And the original building here had a complete front window all the way along it. In the 70s, when I first came here, we had to change part of the front of the building to make a doorway to get back onto the forecourt. But that's how it looked in 1926.
So this place is obviously more than just a job for you, Tim.
Well, yeah, exactly, yes. I've spent the last 32 years in this business, and, you know, it's been my life, really, for that period of time.
Tim's worked hard to keep this old-styled garage alive. There can't be many places left where you can still enjoy the old tradition of attended service. But I wonder if it'll still be here in 10 years' time. The next stop on my journey through disappearing London takes me upstream to the leafy suburbs. I'm here in Hampton Wick, West London, and behind these green hoardings is an old hospital awaiting redevelopment. The plan is to turn it into a hotel or flats. Before it closed nearly 10 years ago, Normansfield was a hospital for people with learning disabilities or mental health problems. At first sight, it looks like a remnant from the bad old days when huge Victorian asylums locked their unfortunate patients well away from the public gaze. But first appearances can be deceptive. When this place first opened as a hospital in 1868, it was way ahead of its time, pioneering new ways of caring for people with learning difficulties. And there are still some reminders of just how special this place was. The most dramatic one is inside this building. But before I take a look inside, I want to find out more about the man who built it. John Langdon Down dedicated his life to people with learning disabilities. In the 1860s, he was the first doctor to recognise the condition which now bears his name, Down syndrome.
At the time that Normansfield was opened, learning disability was dealt with under the Lunacy Act. John Langdon Down had this dream of bringing people with disability into society.
He bought this building in the 1860s as his family home, but it was also a private hospital. Together with his wife Mary, he wanted to create an environment in which his patients could lead fulfilled and creative lives.
John Langdon Down and Mary did something very unusual. They lived in the house. They walked in the grounds. They were with their residents.
In its first year, Normansfield was home to 19 patients, but at its height, there were more than 150. The hospital site gradually expanded until it covered more than 40 acres, complete with villas, orchards, and even a small farm.
Normansfield developed an international reputation. People came here to visit from the United States, from Norway, Sweden. They left records saying what a wonderful place it was and what wonderful people John and Mary were.
The villas are long gone, not to mention the cows and pigs, but one part of the original hospital still survives as a testament to the enlightened Dr. Downs. Wow, what an extraordinary place. And this is it, a fully equipped Victorian theatre, complete with all its original fixtures and fittings. This building is absolutely unique. What on earth is a place like this doing in a hospital? Carol Boys is the chief executive of the Down Syndrome Association. And when one thinks of a theatre in a hospital, I must say one would normally think of an operating theatre, but this is quite a different scenario.
Very different, and very much the passion of Dr. John Langdon Down and his wife.
And he didn't mess about, did he? I mean, this isn't something that's been thrown together. I mean, this is a very opulent space.
He spent a lot of money on this place. We have to remember that the people that he had here, patients, students as we refer to them, were all sons and daughters of people that could afford to pay the fees.
Some of the works on display are unique pieces of Victorian theatre history. And Carol, what are these rather ghostly-looking wall panels here?
Well, they're probably the most important pieces of scenery in the collection here. They were removed during NHS times because they were so important. They were originally used for a performance of Ruddy Gore by D'Oyly Carte in the 1860s at the Savoy. And they must have gone into a sale because that's where Mrs. Langdon Down bought them.
It looks wonderful today, but when the theatre was first handed over to the Trust, it was a very different story.
The floor here had been used as a badminton court during NHS times, and all of the beautiful paintwork and the listed scenery was in a pretty sorry state. It's all been completely restored and
to absolute gorgeousness, yeah.
Absolutely wonderful.
Fabulous doors.
Wonderful, aren't they? Beautiful artwork.
Gorgeous.
Incredible.
And it's all here, all the sets, the flats, all the dangly, sandbaggy things that fall on people's heads in Alfred Hitchcock movies.
Yes, it's all there. All the original lighting is here as well. Not connected, obviously, but we're hoping to get it restored in time.
And a very important historical piece. The great thing, of course, is it's not a museum. It's a living theatre.
Absolutely. We wanted to create a living museum to Dr. Down. There's always something happening here, drama, music, all the things that Dr. Down was using back in Victorian times to work with kids with learning disabilities.
Well, I'm sure if old Dr. Down could see it today, he'd be very pleased indeed.
Oh, I think so. I think so. I think they'd be very happy with what goes on here now.
Every now and then, you come across a place that opens a window to a world you never even knew existed. This place is like that. A reminder that not all Victorian hospitals were filled with doom, gloom and despondency. And thank goodness it's still here. Next time on Disappearing London, I'll be investigating the story of London's oldest football stand and singing the praises of Music Hall with entertainer Roy Hudd.